Have you ever felt someone pulling away from you right when things started to feel real? Have you ever sat there staring at your phone, replaying every conversation in your head, wondering how someone could look at you with so much warmth one day, and then go cold the next? Because that kind of silence does something to you. It makes you question your worth. It makes you wonder if you imagined the connection. It makes you ask one painful question over and over again. If they cared, why would they disappear? But what if the answer is deeper than rejection? What if the distance that is breaking your heart is not always a sign that you are being pushed away, but a sign that you are getting too close to a part of them they do not know how to handle? Stay with this until the end, because if you have ever loved an avoidant, or if you are trying to understand why someone acts close but distant at the same time, what you are about to hear may completely change the way you see their behavior and protect your heart from misunderstanding what was never simple to begin with. The hardest thing about dealing with an avoidant is not the silence. It is not the delayed replies. It is not even the emotional distance. The hardest part is the confusion, because confusion is cruel. Confusion keeps you emotionally trapped. It keeps you hopeful and hurt at the same time. One moment, they open up. They let you in. They say something soft. They stay a little longer. They look at you in a way that feels real. And just when your heart begins to relax, they disappear into themselves again. Suddenly they feel far away. Their energy changes, their words become shorter, their warmth becomes harder to reach. And for most people, that shift feels like one thing only: rejection. But human psychology is not always that simple. Not every person withdraws because they feel nothing. Some people withdraw because they feel too much. And that is where most people get it wrong with avoidance. They look at distance and assume there is no love there. They look at silence and assume the connection meant less than they thought. But in many cases, especially with avoidant people, distance is not always the absence of feeling. Sometimes it is the result of emotional overload. Sometimes the closer they feel to you, the more their inner world begins to panic. That is the part no one tells you. Because most people are taught to see love in obvious ways. They are taught that if someone loves you, they will move closer. They will become clearer. They will become more emotionally available. And yes, healthy love should move in that direction. But avoidants often do not respond to love the way emotionally secure people do. Their nervous system does not always register closeness as comfort. Sometimes it registers closeness as danger. Not because you are dangerous, not because love is bad, but because somewhere deep inside them, emotional intimacy has become linked with loss of control, vulnerability, pressure, or pain. So when an avoidant begins to feel something real for you, they do not always feel excited first. Sometimes they feel exposed. Sometimes they feel cornered by emotions they do not know how to process. Sometimes they feel like they are standing too close to a fire they secretly want, but are terrified to touch. And that is why their behavior becomes so hard to understand. Because from the outside, it looks like they are losing interest. But on the inside, they may be fighting a battle you cannot see. And this is where your pain begins if you do not understand what is happening. Because when someone pulls away, your mind naturally tries to protect you. It starts looking for answers. It starts trying to make sense of the shift. Did I say too much? Did I come on too strong? Did they stop caring? Was I too available? And little by little, you begin carrying emotional weight that was never fully yours. You start blaming yourself for their inconsistency. You start shrinking your needs just to avoid losing them. You start accepting crumbs because you are trying to hold on to the version of them that felt real in the beginning. And that is what makes this so dangerous. Not just because it hurts, but because confusion can make people abandon themselves while trying to understand someone else. But if you really want to understand avoidant behavior, you have to stop reading it only from your own emotional language. You have to understand that not everyone handles connection the same way. Some people are not afraid of love because they do not want it. They are afraid of love because it touches wounds they have spent years trying not to feel. And when that happens, they do what they have trained themselves to do for most of their life. They create space. Space is their survival strategy. Distance is often the only emotional tool they trust. When things feel calm, they can be present. When feelings stay light, they can seem open, charming, even deeply connected. But when the bond starts becoming emotionally significant, something changes inside them. The connection stops feeling easy. it starts feeling heavy, not because you became too much, but because the emotional closeness begins to wake up parts of them they have buried for years. Fear of dependency, fear of losing themselves, fear of needing someone too much, fear of being seen too deeply, fear of being hurt in a place they can no longer hide. And here is the truth that hits hardest. Sometimes the moment an avoidant starts realizing you matter is the same moment they begin pulling away, not because you failed, not because you are not enough, but because your presence is no longer casual to them. It is real now, and real feelings scare people who have spent their whole lives surviving through emotional distance. So if you have been blaming yourself for someone's mixed signals, hear this clearly. Their inconsistency is not always proof that you imagined the connection. Sometimes it is proof that the connection reached a depth they were not emotionally prepared to hold. That does not mean you should romanticize pain. That does not mean every distant person is secretly in love. And it definitely does not mean you should chase someone who keeps wounding you. But it does mean this. If you want to stop suffering and confusion, you must first understand that avoidant love rarely looks calm in the beginning. It often looks like contradiction. It often looks like closeness followed by retreat. It often looks like someone trying to feel safe while also trying not to feel too much. And once you understand that, everything starts to shift, because then you stop asking, why are they acting this way? And start asking the deeper question, what does this behavior actually mean? And that is where things get even more revealing, because the next part is where you begin to see the difference between someone who is simply unavailable and someone who is quietly falling while trying to fight every feeling inside them. What makes this so painful is that once you begin to understand their distance, you also begin to see something even more difficult. Their silence is not random. Their inconsistency is not always careless. A lot of the time, it is the emotional cost of feeling something they were never trained to carry. Because for an avoidant, connection can feel beautiful and threatening at the same time. The very thing they secretly long for can also feel like the very thing that might take away their emotional safety. And when that happens, they do not always move toward love. They often freeze in front of it. This is where people misunderstand avoidance the most. They assume the problem is commitment. They assume the issue is maturity. They assume the avoidant is just confused, selfish, or emotionally unavailable by choice. But the deeper truth is more psychological than personal. Avoidants often learned very early that closeness came with discomfort. Maybe they had to handle emotions alone. Maybe vulnerability was ignored. Maybe they were taught without words that depending on anyone was dangerous. So over time, they built an identity around independence. They became the person who needs no one, asks for little, and keeps emotions under control. That identity protected them. It helped them survive. But survival patterns do not disappear just because love finally shows up. And this is why love can become such a trigger for them. Because love is not just attraction. Love is not just chemistry. Love is not just enjoying someone's company. Real emotional attachment asks for something deeper. It asks for surrender. It asks for honesty. It asks for emotional risk. It asks a person to be seen without armor. And for someone who has spent years building walls just to feel safe, that kind of closeness can feel like losing control of their entire inner world. That is why an avoidant can look calm on the outside while feeling chaos on the inside. You may think they are distant because they are not affected, but often they are distant because they are too affected. Their mind starts racing. Their body starts tightening. Their instincts begin pushing them to create space, even if their heart wants to stay. This is not because they are playing games in the way people usually imagine. It is because their nervous system is trying to protect them from a depth of emotion they do not know how to regulate. What feels intimate to you may feel overwhelming to them. What feels natural to you may feel exposing to them. What feels like love to you may feel like danger to the part of them that still believes closeness ends in pain. And this is why their behavior becomes so contradictory. They may want your presence, but feel trapped when they get too much of it. They may think about you constantly, yet struggle to express anything clearly. They may crave your warmth, then suddenly act cold once it becomes too real. They may feel drawn to you in private, then pull back emotionally when the bond starts deepening. And if you do not understand the psychology behind that pattern, it can break you, Because you will keep trying to solve something that was never caused by your lack of value. You will keep trying to become easier, softer, quieter, more patient, hoping that if you love them correctly, they will finally stop running from what they feel. But emotional fear does not disappear just because someone good enters a person's life. That is one of the most painful truths to accept. You can be safe. You can be honest. You can be loving. You can be everything they once needed. And they can still pull away, not because your love is wrong, but because their inner world has not yet learned how to receive something healthy without panicking. That is why avoidants often seem most stable when the connection is still light. In the early stage, when things are easy, playful, or undefined, they can appear deeply present. They can be thoughtful. They can be charming. They can even make you feel chosen. But when the emotional weight begins to increase, something shifts. Once they realize you matter in a way that can actually affect them, the walls begin rising again. Their protective instincts take over. They become harder to reach. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because the feelings started demanding more honesty than they know how to survive. And that is where the real struggle begins inside them. Because avoidants are not always unaware of what they are doing. In fact, many of them know they are pulling away. Many of them feel guilty for it. Many of them hate the fact that they shut down when something meaningful starts growing, but awareness alone does not heal fear. A person can know they are sabotaging something beautiful and still feel powerless to stop the pattern. They can want closeness and still feel unsafe inside it. They can care deeply and still act in ways that look emotionally disconnected. That contradiction is what confuses people the most. Because love is usually expected to create consistency. It is expected to create effort, clarity, and movement. And in healthy situations, it should. But with avoidance, emotional attachment often activates resistance before it activates stability. The stronger the bond begins to feel, the stronger their instinct to regain control can become. They may start needing more time alone. They may become less expressive. They may create emotional distance without knowing how to explain why. And the person on the other side is left trying to understand how someone can feel close and unreachable at the exact same time. But this is what fear often looks like when it is wearing the mask of detachment. It does not always scream. It does not always confess. It does not always say, "I'm scared of losing myself." Sometimes it just becomes quiet. Sometimes it avoids difficult conversations. Sometimes it disappears emotionally the moment things become serious. Sometimes it acts numb when the feelings underneath are actually too intense to manage. And that is why it is so important not to judge their actions only by surface behavior. Because what looks like indifference is sometimes internal panic. What looks like boredom is sometimes emotional shutdown. What looks like disconnection is sometimes the result of someone trying to avoid drowning in feelings they never learned how to hold. Still, understanding this should not make you lose yourself inside their struggle. Because this is where many people make the mistake of turning pain into hope without boundaries. They begin excusing everything. They begin waiting endlessly. They begin telling themselves that every withdrawal must mean hidden love. But not every emotionally distant person is secretly scared of how much they care. Some are simply not available. Some are simply not willing. And that is why understanding avoidant psychology is not about romanticizing suffering. It is about learning to read emotional patterns clearly so you stop confusing emotional conflict with emotional absence. Because there is a difference, a huge one. And once you learn that difference, you stop chasing every silence as if it contains devotion. You stop idealizing every mixed signal as if it is proof of depth. You stop making yourself smaller just to stay connected to someone who does not know how to stay present. And instead, you begin noticing something much more honest. When an avoidant is truly affected by you, it leaves traces. Not loud ones, not always verbal ones, but real ones. And those traces are what reveal everything, because someone who feels nothing usually leaves with peace, but someone who is emotionally overwhelmed by love rarely does. And that is exactly where the truth begins to reveal itself, because when someone is only distant, they usually drift away in a straight line. Their energy fades, their effort disappears, their presence becomes lighter and lighter until there is almost nothing left to hold on to. But when an avoidant is emotionally attached, the pattern feels very different. It feels messy. It feels unfinished. It feels like someone trying to leave while still emotionally standing at the door. And if you pay close attention, the signs are there. Quiet, subtle, but there. One of the clearest signs is this: they do not disappear with peace. Even when they create space, something in them keeps circling back. Not always in dramatic ways, not always with direct confession, but through little openings, small returns, unexpected check-ins, a message that seems casual but comes at a moment that feels too intentional to be random, a reaction to something you posted, a question they did not need to ask, a reason to reconnect that sounds simple on the surface but carries emotional weight underneath. This is not always love by itself, but when someone keeps finding their way back after trying to detach, it often means the bond is still alive inside them, because people who feel nothing usually move on quietly. They do not wrestle with your absence. They do not keep reopening the door they were trying to close. And avoidance and love often do exactly that. They pull away, but they cannot stay fully gone. They need distance, but distance does not bring them the relief they expected. Instead of peace, they feel tension. Instead of freedom, they feel your absence in ways they cannot explain. That is the contradiction that exposes real emotional investment. If they were truly untouched, stepping back would calm them. It would make life easier. But when feelings are involved, even their escape does not feel emotionally clean. Another sign is the way they remember you. Not in loud romantic gestures, not in perfect emotional language, but in the details. The small things you once mentioned, the passing comment you forgot you made, the habit they noticed without ever saying anything. Avoidants may struggle to express emotion openly, but that does not mean they are not observing deeply. In fact, many of them watch more than they speak. They collect emotional data quietly. They notice shifts in your mood. They remember your fears, your preferences, your little patterns. And when that starts showing up in subtle ways, it matters. Because emotional memory is a form of attachment. People do not carry your details in silence unless some part of you has stayed with them. You may also notice a strange kind of protectiveness. Not always obvious, not always labeled, but present. They may not say, "I care about you," in a way that feels easy and direct, but they may show concern when something feels wrong. They may become more alert when you are hurting. They may ask about things that matter to your life, even if they try to sound casual while doing it. They may step in quietly when you need support, then act like it was no big deal. That is important to notice, because avoidants often reveal emotion through behavior long before they can say it with confidence. Their heart leaks through actions they do not fully know how to explain. And then there is the emotional contradiction that almost always appears when they are truly affected. They struggle to stay close, but they also struggle to let go. That is the sign many people overlook. Because when someone is simply unavailable in a cold, detached way, there is no real inner conflict. They may enjoy attention. They may keep things going for convenience. But deep down, there is no tension between leaving and staying. They can disconnect without carrying much emotional friction. But when an avoidant is in love, there is usually an internal tug of war. You can feel it in the inconsistency, in the hesitation, in the way they move toward you and then retreat, only to reappear again. That kind of pattern is exhausting, yes, but it also reveals something important. They are not at peace with losing the connection. That matters, because real attachment creates friction. It creates emotional resistance. It creates inner noise. And avoidants often reveal love through the very instability they wish they could hide. You may see it in the way they become strangely awkward around emotional moments. They may act distant after a deep conversation. They may seem restless after closeness. They may go quiet after vulnerability instead of becoming warmer. That does not always mean they regretted the moment. Sometimes it means the moment reached deeper than they were prepared for. Sometimes after emotional intimacy, avoidants need to retreat, not because they want less of you, but because they are trying to regulate what your presence awakened inside them. That is why their actions can feel so confusing, because one part of them is being pulled toward connection, and another part is trying to escape the emotional exposure that comes with it. This is also why avoidants in love often become more emotionally noticeable in indirect ways than direct ones. They may not say, "I miss you," but they suddenly start appearing more. They may not openly ask for reassurance, but they watch closely for signs that you still care. They may not confess what you mean to them, but their behavior shifts when they sense distance from you. They may act unaffected, but when they think they are truly losing you, their calm begins to crack. That is when the hidden attachment often becomes impossible to ignore. Because love changes behavior, even when words stay guarded. And if you know what to look for, you begin to see that the signs are not always dramatic. They are often quiet, conflicted, and layered. A person who is emotionally overwhelmed may not know how to love in a way that feels easy to receive. But that does not mean there is no feeling there. It means the feeling is trapped behind defense patterns, fear responses, and years of emotional self-protection. Still, there is something very important you must remember. Recognizing signs of love is not the same as settling for emotional starvation. Understanding someone's fear does not mean abandoning your own needs, and seeing hidden attachment does not mean you should keep bleeding just because their heart is confused. That is where many people lose themselves. They start seeing every return as proof, every breadcrumb as depth, every mixed signal as meaning. But real love, even when wounded, still leaves evidence of care that is consistent enough to feel. It may not be perfect, it may not be easy, but it does not leave you starving forever while asking you to survive on guesses. That is why clarity matters so much, because the goal is not just to know whether they feel something. The deeper question is whether what they feel is strong enough to move them toward growth. And that is where everything changes, because love is not only about emotion, it is also about what a person does when those emotions become impossible to ignore. And when an avoidant reaches that point, the truth becomes harder for them to hide, even from themselves. Because sooner or later, every mask reaches its limit. Every defense pattern reaches a point where it can no longer fully hide what is happening underneath. And when an avoidant reaches that emotional edge, something very revealing begins to happen. The distance may still be there. The fear may still be there. The hesitation may still show up. But beneath all of it, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. They are no longer running from you. They are running from what you make them feel. That difference changes everything. Because once you understand that, you stop taking every strange shift as a statement about your worth. You stop measuring your value by someone else's inability to stay emotionally steady. You stop assuming that silence always means you are not enough. And for many people, that realization is the first real moment of emotional freedom, because one of the deepest wounds love can create is not heartbreak itself. It is self-doubt. It is the slow poison of wondering why your care was not received in the way you hoped. It is the mental exhaustion of trying to decode someone who made you feel seen one day and invisible the next. And if you stay in that cycle too long, you begin to lose your center. That is why this truth matters so much, not just because it helps you understand them, but because it helps you come back to yourself. Because loving someone with avoidant patterns can make you forget one very important thing. Understanding another person should never cost you your own peace. You can be compassionate without becoming consumed. You can recognize emotional fear without turning your life into a waiting room. You can see the pain inside someone and still decide that your heart deserves stability. That is not cold. That is not selfish. That is emotional maturity, and this is where the deepest lesson begins. A lot of people spend years trying to be enough for someone who is at war with closeness. They think if they stay patient long enough, love carefully enough, and ask for less, eventually the other person will feel safe enough to stop pulling away. But healing does not happen because someone else is loving enough to rescue a person from their own patterns. Healing begins when the avoidant themselves becomes honest about what they are doing, why they are doing it, and what it is costing them. Without that self-awareness, even real love can keep crashing into the same wall. Because love alone does not automatically create emotional readiness. That is one of the hardest truths people resist. Someone can feel deeply for you and still not know how to hold a healthy bond.